So I'm going to, without further ado, to turn now to David Pannick. David, it would be quite interesting to hear from you about the case for constitutional innovation around the BBC. Do you think there's a need for a different model? If there were, how could we make it viable? What would be the mechanics of a shift in the model? David Pannick, over to you.
Well, the BBC Charter is an anomaly. Almost every other public body is regulated by a statute which has been debated, has been amended in Parliament. A statute which sets out the relevant principles, sets out the objectives of the public body, a statute which defines and which confines the powers and the duties of ministers. You then, of course, have delegated legislation, which itself is put before Parliament and can be debated, and which contains detailed provisions. This is the tried and tested constitutional model for regulating a public body in this country. And I think it's only for reasons of historical accident that the BBC is still regulated by Royal Charter rather than by legislation. This is not some sort of constitutional intricacy that we don't need to worry about. It has real practical effects. A Royal Charter has very substantial disadvantages for the BBC and for the public. And it has very considerable advantages for ministers compared with legislation. Ministers enjoy very considerable powers to define the contents of each Royal Charter, free from parliamentary control, indeed free from public scrutiny. I don't suggest there are not other pressures on ministers, of course there are, but they are free from the need to identify their proposals, to debate them in Parliament, to respond to detailed amendments and criticisms of them. A charter also involves limited transparency until the final product is published. It's right, of course, there is a danger for the BBC in statutory regulation. Parliament may produce an unsatisfactory regulatory scheme. But my advice to the BBC is that it would be far better to try to arrive at a principled, coherent statutory scheme which sets out in legislation the relevant principles as to the functions of the BBC, the scope of its services, its independence, and its funding. Of course, funding would require a scheme which would need to be implemented every 5 or 10 years, but much better to have these principles set out rather than left to the discretion of ministers. The harsh political reality, I think, is that reliance on ministerial discretion may well have been acceptable in the past when there was a shared vision of what the BBC was for and of the need to provide necessary funding. But I'm doubtful, others will express their own views, I'm doubtful the BBC any longer can rely on such shared norms within government. So that's my statement of where I would like the BBC to be as a matter of constitutional status. However, one has to be realistic, and I think it is looking increasingly unlikely that a move to a statutory basis is going to occur, at least in the short term. You mentioned, Colette, the views of Lord Inglewood and Norman Fowler, but there's simply no time for such a reform before the expiry of the current charter, and my understanding is that the current Secretary of State does not favour statutory regulation. And if that's right, it's simply not going to happen in the short term. So what should be done instead? Well, my suggestion to the BBC, and indeed to ministers, is that the next charter should contain provisions which address two matters. First, the next charter really has to set out a process by which the charter after that will be agreed. It must set out a timetable for consultation with the BBC and with the public on what the following charter will contain. The present procedure is woefully inadequate because it lacks transparency and it gives ministers far too much power to make last-minute, take it or leave it proposals. And secondly and finally, the next charter needs, I think, to contain some provisions which address how we are going to identify the relevant principles which can be enshrined in an agreement or in the following charter. And we need to have a process for trying to identify what these principles are. Principles of independence, scope of services, and the means by which funding is agreed. And I think what the next charter needs to contain, or at least an agreement needs to contain, is an agreement between the BBC and government that there will be a process of independent inquiry into the identification of what these principles should be. Independent inquiry may or may not be the most attractive proposition to put today to a gathering of people talking about the BBC. But that's what we need in this context.